Welcome back to our second episode of our science-based podcast, where we interview our second chemical engineer. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, right. You can give your introduction about yourself.
No, great, Jordan and Jun. Very nice to meet you. My name is Leslie. I'm Jordan's dad, so I want to mention that up front first. But I work in the pharmaceutical industry. I worked with GlaxoSmithKline, which is a healthcare company, for 22 years. And I studied chemical engineering while I was in university, and I have a real passion for chemistry. So I hope that's me. And we've been in Shanghai for the last 12 years, and prior to that in Australia and in Singapore. I'm born Singaporean, and I'm an Australian citizen by nationality. Yeah.
Okay, so the first question we wanted to ask you today is, were you always interested in like the subject of chemistry? And if so, what sparked your interest for the subject?
Yeah, I actually, when I was a young guy like you were, I didn't have a big objective, really. I just floated through college and through high school. But one thing that pricked my interest was a good friend by the name of John Huang, whose dad was actually a professor of chemistry at the university in Singapore. And I liked the way that he explained when we had times where I had dinner or was given a car ride by his dad, talking about chemistry and how he made it come alive. I like things that are not conceptual in nature. I like things that I can see in real life. So that's sparked my interest in chemistry. Yeah.
So you obviously studied chemistry in university, right?
I studied chemical engineering, and I'll come to that in a second. There was less chemistry in chemical engineering, which that'll be surprising to you, but a lot more math. So be careful when you sign up for chemical engineering. It's a lot more math than it is in chemistry, but it gets even more interesting then because you see how things are made in large scale and in factories, etc. Yeah.
So what was it like studying chemical engineering in university?
As I mentioned, it was a shock to me that there was a lot more math involved, a lot more concepts about liquids and how they float inside a pipe. Can you imagine that, right? Because actually, chemical engineering is a glorified name for being a good plumber. You need to transport materials from one place to another. But because I studied in Australia, mining industry was a big industry there, and you learned a lot about how to extract minerals from the ground. At the same time, my experience at university is and also an experience to work with others to do projects, and that becomes quite a core part of graduating. You need to work with others on designing processes, but within each process, there's a unit operation which involves chemistry. Hydrogenation is one. Distillation, which I think you guys have studied already, around fractionation of crude oil, right, into its elements. Those sorts of things appear, but they appear in industrial grade, right, tons rather than grams, right? So and those are the things that I experience at university. Yeah.
So the next question kind of relates to the first question. It's like, was there any like specific reason that you chose chemical engineering to major in college?
I have to admit to both of you, no, it was because my mom actually thought it was a good idea, full stop. So I really didn't have at that stage. So now Jordan knows the secret. I've always put this pressure on, you got to know what you're going to do. You got to have a direction. But actually I didn't really. I just went into it thinking it was a good idea. My mom made a decision for me and sent me away to Australia to study. So I can't give you an intellectual answer there, boys. It was just simply because my mom told me it was a good idea.
So you started your college as like a chemical engineer when you entered college. So when you first entered, what did you find most challenging?
I think the first thing was the educational system, to be honest, because Jun, I grew up in Singapore. So the educational system is in some ways, the closest analog is China. So you just memorize, you don't even understand, doesn't matter, just memorize like heck, right? But then when I went to first year university, it was all about understanding. Now, I did very well in my exams because you memorize And with A levels, your first year in university in Australia was a breeze. So I scored A and Bs, which I never seen in my life, right? But when it came to projects where you had to apply, I suffered like crazy. So I'm very glad to know that at least I know that Jordan and yourself are in an educational system at the moment where it forces you to think about how you apply. But then, of course, you're going to back that up with the depth of application and knowledge, which is your math, your trigonometry, and all the rest of it. But for me, the biggest impact was application and not knowing how to do that with a group of students that I didn't know very well. Yeah.
So, like, when you studied chemistry in college, right, what was like one specific part of that course that you found like the most interesting?
It was hydrocarbons. I love that. I love the benzene ring. I love all the CH, methane, ethane, all that stuff. The reason for that is that it made a lot of sense to me, given Australia then was a big gas processor, right, of offshore natural gas. And then in the summer holidays, I worked with a company called Chemcore in Australia as well, where I learned to see how fractionation and distillation for fine chemicals happen. So I think for me, that's the part that really got me excited was looking at hydrocarbons. So any organic chemistry, I loved it, man. I really did. That was the part I really enjoyed the most. And I think I had a good professor at university that made it interesting by blowing things up in the lab, safely, of course, but helping us enjoy it as well as understand it. Yeah.
So did your interest for the organic chemistry have like an impact on your job choice, like the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, it definitely did, because one of the first jobs I got was working with a company that did engineering and construction for Exxon, and I think it's one of the world's largest oil producers, or Esso as it was called then, or Exxon. And I got to work in an offshore refinery off the coast of Singapore. I took a boat there every morning, and I came back in the evening, and that was the dream job for me. I worked there as an intern, and then subsequently worked for them to help them design or be part of the engineering efforts. And it took me also to Vietnam, where they built a bitumen factory. So all the heavies and distillation, right? They go into making roads, but you can imagine those countries in those days were beginning to develop, right? They need to build roads. And so I worked then for Shell as well, which were building, we had a bitumen factory in the south of Vietnam, and I worked there for several months. So I think, yeah, for a young engineer, I mean, you travel, you get to design plants and not blow them up, hopefully, and you work with a real, you realize that you're not the only specialty. There's chemical engineering, looks after the process. There's civil engineering, looking after the piling and the foundations of the factory. And then you have other people you work with, the mechanical engineers who look after the piping. Right, so each pipe, the strength of each pipe, whether you use stainless steel, carbon steel. So you realize that you're only just one discipline in a complete set of other expertise that you require to do something.
So after working in like the oil industry for so long, like why did you decide to transition to the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, I know, Jun, you're like an HR manager there, my friend. You're asking all the right questions. Why you changed your job, Leslie? I begin to mature a little bit. Jordan would be happy at that, to understand why I was trying to do something. And I think for you guys, you got to find your purpose at some point in time. And for me, I wanted to save lives. I wanted to benefit the health of human beings. So one day as an engineer, I looked in the newspapers in Singapore, and Glaxo, it was called then, were looking for engineers. And I said, how can a pharmaceutical company want chemical engineers? What do they do there, right? So I applied, and after 6 rounds of an interview, I got the job. So it made me really happy, because I wasn't a doctor or a medic, but I had a part to play in helping people have a better life, medically speaking. So I joined Glaxo then. It was a great experience. And as you know, I've not left the company. I'm still there after 22 years. Yeah.
So like diving into your journey to where you are today, what is one thing that you learned in college, but it could be in general, that helped you prepare for work? And was there anything that you learned outside of college that helped you master discipline when you were now that you're in your job?
Well, it's a very broad question, but I think one thing I realized was you need to work with others. So if you say you don't like to work with people, then go to research, right? But even a researcher today, to find the latest inventions, you need to know how to work with others. And that's something that ingrained into me while I was in Australia studying engineering, is how you work with others. How do you listen to other thoughts? How do you debate? Don't always assume you're right. And later, one of the things I learned when I started work was I had this very naive feeling with me that I can be whatever I wanted to be. So I encourage you that although you start as an engineer looking after pipes and plumbing, I'm now in a job that people don't believe I'm a chemical engineer because I've been through different occupations or different roles in my company. I'm not an engineer anymore. I don't calculate pipes and pumps anymore. So how did I get here? Was because I started with a dream, actually. One of the early days as a young manager, I wrote down I wanted to lead a cross-functional team. It was as simple as that. And then one day I changed it to I wanted to lead a team to launch a new product for the company. So over the years, I kept updating that plan, and I had good managers that helped me. And one day, one of them was, do you want to come to China? I was living in Melbourne then. Jordan was about 4 years old, and his brother was 2. It was a big change. So another thing you need to consider as you mature is geography matters. And don't forget, you can never separate your work from your private life. You got to take that into account, right? When you're going to get married, where will you be? All those things matter because in a whole scheme of things, work is just one part of it. Yeah.
So obviously you talked about how like collaboration and stuff that you experienced in college was very helpful for you in your job. But then were there any other things that you wish college would have taught you that would have helped you prepare for your real like job?
Yeah, I think one of the things that most universities are struggling with is how to prepare graduates for the workforce. And I won't mention countries, but having interviewed many graduates for jobs within GSK and hired them, especially at fresh graduate level, I find the graduates that I love to hire are those that have worked already. And what I mean by that is doesn't mean they work with another company, but they have done McDonald's. They work for Burger King. They know how to clean tables. They know how, and I think that allows that maturity of that fresh graduate, because what we don't want is someone who's self-centered, who's selfish, and has no life skills. So I think someone who has top grades, but has no life skills, I don't hire them. In fact, a lot of companies have said I hire for attitude and I train for skill. Because if an employee has a poor attitude, believe me, to exit this employee from the company is not easy. And the pain that you go through in your team, because you're only as good as your weakest link in your team, right? And you guys know that. So one thing I've also learned in my college, and I hope that most universities will do that for people like yourself, is prepare you for working life. It is hard, but also not to lose your way, because when you graduate, there's a few things that are going to happen. First thing, you're probably not going to be happy with the money that you draw, your salary. Then all of a sudden, you may meet a life partner. Then you got to figure out, where am I going to be? Do I have to, move cities or towns? I'm doing well in my job. What's my career? And all these life skills, right? I hope that universities will just wrap that up and give you a lot more exposure into what to expect, because otherwise you make wrong choices. The other choice you could make that you need to be careful is jumping and job hopping. And that unfortunately comes with people in your generation. Sorry to brand, I don't mean to, but Gen Zs, which are perhaps older than you lot, they don't stay in one company for very long. It's 2 years, 3 years, and they say, man, I'm moving for money, or I want to become vice president overnight. That don't happen, as you know, unless, of course, you run your own company, which a lot of them try to do but fail. So I think so. I think it goes back to ensuring that graduates or postgraduates have a purpose for their lives. You know what I mean? A meaningful purpose, and you live your dream, right? If you have no purpose, then you're going to really suffer when you graduate, because some chemical engineers turn up to do rubbish stuff. Some doctors eventually, after 6 years of medical school, do something completely unrelated and have no value, but they've taken up a valuable space at medical school that could be given to somebody else. So that purpose matters, yeah.
So after college, you mentioned that you worked in several different businesses before you moved to the pharmaceutical industry. What from that work experience before entering the pharmaceutical industry initially made you make that jump into to where you are today?
I actually only had 2 jobs, and one of them was before pharma and in oil and gas, and the other one in pharmaceuticals or healthcare. One thing that I was good at was I was good at listening. So make sure that, listening, there's 2 parts of listening: listening to understand and listening for the sake of listening and nodding, right? So it got me promoted quite quickly in Australia to different roles. In fact, that was the first, sorry, boys, I know this is going to be in a podcast. So I was the first Asian in an all-white leadership team, our executive team in a factory, right? And it's not easy, I have to say, at those days, right? It's a lot easier now because things have moved on. And it was actually a result of one of my bosses giving me a chance. He said, if I don't step up for my position, you'll never be promoted. So he actually left his role, moved to the UK, and I was in Melbourne then, to allow me to take the senior level position. His name is Jim Ryan. So if he does listen to this podcast, thanks, Jim. I always really, really grateful to him to giving me that chance. So there's one thing is giving people a chance to step up, right? So if you're a boss one day, June, just make sure you give somebody else a chance, right? Someone that right down the pole or right down the ladder, give them a chance, because they could just change their world completely. Second thing is that in GSK, I worked in 8 different roles in the company over the last 22 years. So I worked in supply chain. I worked as a factory manager. I worked in business development, looking at how to outsource and to buy products for the company. I worked in unfortunately a major crisis that my company got into in China with the Chinese government, but I learned how the government works. And then I moved on to corporate affairs, which looks at media and talking to government stakeholders. Price cuts, making medicines more accessible to people that can't afford it, for example. Then I went to vaccines business unit for 2 years, right? When I was head of marketing and sales for vaccines, and vaccines is obviously a very hot topic. And then I moved on as the chief of staff to my senior vice president, looking at writing a strategy for the country. And last but not least, I'm looking at how we can really transform the culture in my current role. So you can see that how did an engineer land up in so many different roles outside a factory, outside pumps and pipes, because I had good managers, that's one. And number 2, I just was curious. What was the other guy doing? What was the other guy's job like? And maybe I could do it. And so I hope you guys would always stay curious, because that's going to help you explore the world around you. If you're not curious, like I was back when my mother said, you do chemical engineering, I wasn't curious enough to understand what it is. I just said yes, then you might miss out on something. Yeah.
So you just said that when you first got into chemical engineering, you were surprised at how much math there were involved. But then is there anything else that you would want people to know about chemical engineering before stepping into that realm?
The other piece is how engineering or chemical engineering in itself as a study, as a field of study, opens itself up to a broad range of industries you can work in. One of them is biomedical. One of them is in the food industry, which is really big, where we come from in Australia. Those are the areas. Mining. A lot of chemical engineers are now senior government officials around the world. So I think as an engineer or a professional, it teaches you logic, it teaches you planning, It also helps you methodically to assess risk, right? So everything is done with risk in this world. So I think broadly an engineering degree, or particularly chemical engineering in today's world, is super important, especially with global warming and other issues, right? So a lot of chemical engineers are into recycling of water, all that stuff. So a chemical engineer can basically do almost anything. And I believe one of the finance ministers of a country I won't mention on the call is also a chemical engineer by training. So how did this person end up running the treasury for a country? So that gives us great hope. But I'm not to knock other professions. I think other degrees would give you the same latitude. But because you asked me about chemical engineering, I think it's a very versatile degree to take you into various areas that you like to do in the future. Yeah.
So do you recommend students who look into like these fields of careers, and like, do you recommend that people should go into and study hard for these kind of jobs that you've mentioned so far?
Could you repeat the last bit? Is that could you?
So
Yeah.
do you recommend people to pursue a career in the pharmaceutical industry?
Right. I think it's going to be up to the interest of a personal interest of individuals. But if you ask me, I would say yes, because you could have the best industry, the best inventions, but if you're not around to see it, I think it's a shame, right? So how do we enable people to live an energetic, a very purposeful life? I mean, I would make sure that healthcare is one of the areas where it can make a difference. And I think we've all experienced that with vaccines recently, right? It used to take 5 years to bring a vaccine, or even longer in some countries, 10 years from concept to getting in somebody's arm, being injected, 10 years. It took the mRNA guys, how long? 6 months. So you can see how much science, if people are willing, obviously there's a lot of checks and balances, to make sure it's safe. But you can imagine that mRNA saved majority of the world from a lot of trouble with COVID. You can also see that apart from vaccines, there's also treatment, right? But with the Pfizer pill and other treatments like GSK, we have sotrovimab on the market, which is an IV that prevents COVID patients from getting into ICU. Right, where you're really going to be in intensive care and big trouble. But can you imagine that if you're the engineer involved in the manufacture, or the chemist in the laboratory that was identified the molecule and said, hey boss, this works? Or are you the clinician that looked at the molecule and said it does have a clinical effect, right? I mean, it's a priceless thing, right? You can't get the same satisfaction working for a tobacco company selling cigarettes, can you, right? So I'll stop there, as I'll get in trouble with those in the industry. But I think that's precisely what it is. You have a purpose and you make a real difference. Of course, environment is another. A number of plastics that we see with antigen test kits that all of us have to take every day now. I mean, can you imagine the waste that it generates? And chemical engineers are also called on to make a difference in making some of these plastics, single-use plastics, for example, biodegradable. All these things require someone with a knowledge of chemistry. So I don't know whether, Jordan, that you asked me a very broad question, but I hope that helps. Yeah.
So like with COVID, like recently being like such a big topic, do you think that had like any impact on like the students that are pursuing pharmaceuticals or like becoming like doctors?
I think so, and my personal advice is being a doctor is a calling. It should never be a career to say I want to make money, because I suggest if you want to, then do something quite different. And that calling could then turn from someone with clinical experience into a researcher, right? And I think the research now is about prevention of health rather than treatment, because you're treating someone's already sick. The other thing could be is around aged care, right? There's a lot of aging population here, and in China, I think there'll be millions that will be over the age of 60 in the next 5 or 10 years. How do you help this generation? And slowly, I'm going to be one of that generation soon. Is be productive, even when they're old, right? So I think if you ask me, is there a job for people like that in COVID times? Absolutely, because if there's another variant change that's deadly and transmissive, we're in trouble, right? Because now everyone says, it's not like Delta, it's more transmissive, but it won't kill anybody. But can you imagine if it mutates to one that kills like Delta and transmits like Omicron, then we're really in trouble. So I think it's also causing people like yourself one day that you can become in part of government or policy maker, right? How the countries work together to prevent disease, right? So I think, again, a very broad question, but I hope I went somewhere to answer that. Yeah.
So in your current job placement, how much of the chemistry you actually learned in university do you apply to your job today?
Zero. So I'm no longer in that side of town. I don't look at the molecules or pipes and design anymore. But from time to time there is a discussion in the company about how do we commit to energy reduction and those sorts of things. And I do understand when I read something, but I apply almost close to zero of what I've learned at university at my time. But if there's a question or there's a problem that requires management to decide investments, for example, then I will be able to ask the right questions. So just another advice for aspiring graduates or people entering college is learning to ask questions is a key leadership quality. So you don't have to be the expert at everything, but because of your training, either in chemistry or chemical engineering, when you're put as maybe you want to start your own company, right? Maybe you say, I want to recycle water, or I want to do something with planting my own plants next to a restaurant so I don't have to truck it to the restaurant, hydroponics or whatever. When someone sells you something, you're able to say, well, hang on, what's the specification for the unit? See, straight away. Engineers always say specification, capacity, throughput, and then the engineering. So how does your kit work? What's the reaction involved to give me an outcome? So I can ask those questions without knowing the chemistry. And then based on the answers, I can decide whether I'm being duped or whether I'm being told the truth, right? So I think, so these sort of training helps me to decipher some of the issues. But the other thing is a quality of education. So you guys might be thinking sometimes school's boring and everything, but if you get to my age, you will treasure the quality of your education. So go home and thank your parents. So Jordan, hin, because a quality of education makes a huge, huge difference when you start to work. Right? And I see that between, and I'm not trying to compare individuals, but I see a difference in opinion between a view expressed by an uneducated person and a view expressed by an educated person. I don't think that either side is right or wrong, but I do see a major difference.
All right, so you just talked about like how like COVID may have like how like the development of the pharmaceutical industry made advancement towards the vaccine research. Do you think like after this case of COVID, do you think like the pharmaceutical industry will be pushed to like new extents, or do you think there'll be like a reform in any way?
No, I think so, Jun. It's a good question. I think the reform could happen in 2 or 3 parts. I think the first reform is, why does it take normally so long for a medication or a vaccine to hit the market? From research to development to allowing patients to use. And I think that a lot of regulators around the world, because a medicine is regulated, which means it has to be approved by government. I think there'll be some soul searching because sometimes we wait too long because there's various clinical trials you need to do, etc. So that's one. 2, I think there'll be a broader interest in new technologies like mRNA. And I think in our case, what does mRNA got to do with curing HIV? cancer. So people are now looking at mRNA beyond COVID into other areas as a platform technology. So I think that's another. The last but not least is, I think there's a word that's complex and I can't prepare it, but it's something that we talked about in the company, is around biopreparedness. What it means is that, is COVID the last virus that's going to hit the world? And the answer, if you read Bill Gates' book, no. So the question is how countries around the world can share virus samples and say, hey, I've seen this, share the information very quickly, learn how to make vaccines and scale up very quickly in case of another pandemic. So I think when countries don't work together, then we're in trouble, because you don't share, and because the fact that we travel so much these days, a virus, as we've seen in one part of the world, can transmit very quickly to another. So I think there'll be three big things that I think that could help. But by the way, guys, if you want to know the guy, the guru that we should listen to is actually Bill Gates. Now, you might say, well, Leslie is not a businessman. Sorry, he's not a healthcare practitioner, but he's just a businessman who's retired. What does he know? That guy reads a lot. So if you don't read a lot, you have a problem, or you will have a problem. So just hint again. I think it's good to look at all the good stuff in social media, but read widely as you can. And Bill Gates, his book on pandemic preparation will give you some answers to your questions here.
So what has fundamentally changed about your line of work when you started until now? So like comparing when you first started 22 years ago and now.
Well, I think one is I'm working from home, right? So I think in my time it was 9 to 5. You have to be in the office. It was just that lifestyle. There was no other lifestyle, right? So I think now that we're able to work remotely whenever, how long, doesn't have to be in a particular location. So I think that has changed dramatically. So for you guys, you know, I know there's sometimes the prestige of going to a Fortune 500 company and going to the offices and working out there. But maybe by the time you guys get there, there is no office. There could be just a meeting center, but you're all working remotely around the world. So that's one, remote working. Two, the use of data analytics. In my time, I think we got as far as one spreadsheet. Oh, if we got a little bit more tense and intense, we went into spreadsheets with pivot tables. But now you've got a computing power that's beyond imagination, right? So I know I don't wish to profess that I know what AI is and everything in its own regards, but one thing I would encourage you to do, if you're doing statistics and you flunked in it, go back and do it again, right? Make sure you know your stats and your basics and the bias in data very, very well. Because if you master that, whatever career you decide on is going to help you, because in the future, everything will be a 36% of this, a probability of error, right? A coefficient of probabilities, the R-squared value, to say you have a correlation between A and B. This is a basis of AI, because a lot of people will tell you, hey, I know AI, but trust me, it starts from stats. If you don't know your stats, you cannot interpret those numbers, because some of them are going to blind you because they have bias, right? So you need to figure that out. So in my world, it was data analytics. And the last I would say is expectations from society has changed so much. In the old days, you earn money and you get blind rich from doing whatever you want. I'm talking about a company here. No one really cares. Now, everybody cares about what your company does or not do. So if you ever become a CEO of a company, or you guys are working, you can no longer say, hey guys, I don't kill anybody by doing that. Now be careful of what you say. The very fact I said something like this could also get an executive in trouble, right? So we do train our executives very well. We can't go on in case our medicines don't work and I'm on TV and camera, I can't say words like that, because it's socially not acceptable. So the socially acceptable bit is something that you have to deal with. because expectation on race, color, sex, gender, environmental protection, rights of the human, rights of the child. I mean, I think it's important, but some parts of it could be unreasonable. So I think it's something that you need to learn when you get to university, where hopefully your professors and your lecturers will give you more latitude to speak off the cuff. But when you start working, you have to be mindful of what you say, and what you say to your employees as well as to stakeholders around. Yeah.
Okay. So our final question for today is there any like memorable experiences that you have like throughout your like working career?
I think there's one I'll share this. I might embarrass Jordan a little bit, but when he was, I don't know how old he was, when he was 6 years old or something, or I think slightly older maybe, I brought him to one of our facilities, our manufacturing facilities in Suzhou. He probably doesn't remember. And also to Tianjin, where we had a facility in the north. And I remember the one in Suzhou, he actually was at one of our safety meetings, because we take safety on our factories very, very seriously. And he was actually taking notes from the PowerPoint. So I don't know whether he takes good notes now from his teacher's PowerPoint, but he was certainly taking notes. But that was a highlight, because then I feel proud that I'm able to show my children what I do, right? Because it matters a lot to me. So that's one moment. The other was actually as a young engineer, going down on my birthday. Actually, it was a very important operation. It was a hydrogenation operation. Now, if you don't know what hydrogenation is, go read it up, because it's a very explosive process where we actually want to transform one of our molecules using bromine as well. And you know bromine, which is it's in your element, in your table of elements. It's a gaseous compound, as you know. I hope you guys know that, and is extremely toxic. But I had to transfer bromine into a hydrogenation reaction as a young engineer on a radio, telling the operators in factory what valves to turn off and turn on. So I felt, in my first time in my life, I felt, well, this is no joke, yeah? This is it. If I give the wrong instructions, then people will die. So that was my first sort of coming to terms with, if you want to get promoted, you're going to know how to take responsibility, right? So it doesn't come with just power and position. It becomes from taking care of the people that work for you as well. So those are the two things, and that are worth calling out to people like yourselves. Yeah.
So thank you a lot for your time today answering all these questions. I know it can be a bit tough, recalling all the information that you provided for us today.
No, it's a pleasure, Jordan and Jun, and I wish you all the best with your CAS project. But if there's anything that you want to know outside this call, please feel free to wind Jordan up, and he'll get in touch, I'm sure. At dinner time tonight, I think. Yeah. But all the best, guys. Yeah. I hope you do well, and I hope you got everything that you wanted to from this session today.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Jun. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you're interested, you can check out other episodes on our channel where we interviewed another chemist.